The moment the plane touched down, I smiled. Not because the flight was smooth, it wasn't. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and my stomach ached from the half-empty coffee I'd nursed since the layover. But I smiled because I was minutes away from seeing him, after 3 months of skipped dinners, canceled hair appointments, and quietly selling off things I swore I'd never part with. I had finally saved enough to buy the ticket. It wasn't just a flight, it was a promise, a beginning. I had imagined his face at the arrival's gate over and over, the way he'd light up, pull me into his arms, whisper, "I knew you'd come." Instead, I walked off that plane and stood. Alone, my phone buzzed once. Landed. I replied, "Yes, just now." And then nothing. Not a single message after that. Just silence. I waited 20 minutes, then 40, then over an hour. People came and went. Reunions happened around me in slow motion. Hugs, flowers, tears. I stood still. At first I told myself maybe he was parking, maybe traffic, maybe anything, but deep down I felt it. That cold, creeping realization that I was alone. I opened our chat again, the same one where we used to say goodnight with little hearts and private jokes. And that's when it hit. This user is no longer available. Blocked, just like that. No warning, no explanation. I stared at the screen, trying to make it make sense, trying to believe this wasn't happening, that I hadn't spent 90 days skipping meals just to stand abandoned in an unfamiliar city, holding my suitcase and a heart that now weighed more than everything I'd packed. And still, part of me kept hoping it was a mistake. I stayed at the airport until the cleaning crew began sweeping under the benches. I kept refreshing the app, rereading old messages like maybe they held a clue, a crack, anything I'd missed. But they were all still there, untouched, unanswered. I scrolled up to the very first one where he'd called me the kindest surprise of his year, and remembered how those words had felt like light in my chest. He said he'd never met anyone who listened the way I did, who made him feel grounded even when the world spun too fast, and I believed him. Every late-night call, every laugh across the distance, every shared playlist and whispered plan, he told me to come. He asked me to. Said he missed me too much to wait another month, and I stupidly, faithfully found a way to make it happen. I worked 2 jobs, I cut corners, no one noticed. I skipped lunch so he could have my presence. And now, I was just nothing. I stood up slowly, legs numb, walked toward the restroom, locked myself into a stall, and finally let the tears fall silent. Hot, not because I was heartbroken, but because I felt discarded. Like something used up, forgotten. I hadn't even told anyone I was flying out. I wanted it to be a surprise, a romantic gesture. Now I couldn't even ask for help without explaining the whole shameful thing. I looked at myself in the mirror afterward, puffy eyes, lips trembling, hair flat from the flight. I didn't recognize the girl staring back. She looked like she'd believed too hard in something soft, and she was alone now, with nowhere to go, no one to call, and nothing but an echo where love had once lived. I ended up in the airport cafe, ordering the cheapest thing on the menu just so I wouldn't be asked to leave. A tea bag and lukewarm water. No sugar, no milk. I stared at it like it might offer answers. Like it might say, "You didn't imagine it." He really did care, but it didn't. The cup stayed silent, just like him. I sat there for hours, pretending to read an outdated brochure, pretending I still had somewhere to go, but I didn't. I had used everything I had on that ticket, not just money, but hope, dignity, pieces of my own self-worth chipped away, one sacrifice at a time. And now I was here, in a strange city with one backpack, a half-charged phone, and no place to sleep. I opened the Maps app just to feel like I had direction. I zoomed in and out, tapping randomly, trying to fool myself into feeling control. I could book a hostel, I told myself. I could find a job, maybe, but every possibility felt like a crack in the floor beneath me. I had come here to be held, not to survive. I messaged him one last time, even though I knew it wouldn't go through. "I'm here. I don't know why you did this, but I'm still here." Then I deleted the thread. I couldn't look at it anymore. I leaned back in the chair and looked around at couples laughing, families wheeling suitcases, a little girl asking her dad if the plane could fly upside down. Life was moving on all around me, and I was just sitting still, in a chair that wasn't mine, in a story I no longer understood. I found a budget hostel to bus rides away from the airport, the kind that doesn't ask questions as long as you pay in cash. I had just enough for 2 nights, if I didn't eat. The room was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of bleach and regret. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, staring at the wall like it might tell me what to do next. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, and I counted the curls like they were seconds. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My body felt too empty for that. It was as if my emotions had gotten off the flight and left me behind. I checked my bank account again, even though I already knew the number. $8.27. That was the price of believing someone who never planned to catch me. I tried to eat a granola bar I'd stuffed in my bag, but even chewing felt like effort. I curled under the thin blanket, fully dressed, and stared at the flickering ceiling light. He had told me this city would feel like magic if we explored it together. Now it felt like punishment, like a lesson in how quickly love can turn into absence. I kept replaying his words in my mind, those little voice notes, the way he used to say my name like it mattered, and I wondered if any of it had ever been real, or if I was just another woman he entertained until the fantasy got too close to the ground. Somewhere in that room between hunger and heartbreak, I began to understand something that hurt more than being blocked. He didn't just leave. He erased me quietly, as if I had never existed in his world at all. The next morning I walked, until my feet ached, not to go anywhere in particular, but just to move. The city was loud, alive, and different. I passed cafes with couples laughing over breakfast, shop windows filled with things I couldn't afford, and parks where people stretched in the sunlight like nothing bad had ever touched them. I wandered into a museum with free admission just to be indoors. Inside it was quiet and cool, filled with strangers who weren't trying to hurt me. I stood in front of a painting, a woman in a field, alone, eyes closed, wind in her hair, and felt something sting behind my eyes. Not sadness, not anymore, something closer to recognition. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I left I felt slightly more human. At a small corner bookstore, I asked if they needed part-time help. The owner looked at my face, tired, foreign, cracked, and said no. But she let me sit in the back for an hour where I pretended to read a travel guide while charging my phone. I didn't tell anyone why I was there. I didn't tell anyone I had nowhere to go, because part of surviving when you've been humiliated is pretending it's all fine even when it isn't. I texted a friend back home, asked if she could send a little money. She didn't ask questions, just replied, "Of course. Are you okay?" I typed yes and stared at it for 5 minutes before hitting send, because what do you say when you've spent 3 months starving yourself for someone who vanished before you even saw his face? That evening, I sat on a bench near the train station, clutching a warm paper cup of tea I could finally afford thanks to my friend's kindness. The platform bustled with motion, people arriving, people departing, people waiting. I watched them all with the quiet detachment of someone whose world had paused while everything else kept spinning. A man next to me scrolled through photos on his phone, smiling softly. I looked away. I didn't want to see anyone being loved right then. Not when I felt like I had been tricked into begging for it. I pulled out a small notebook from my bag. One I had packed full of plans, places he said we'd go together. Little quotes I'd scribbled when our late-night calls felt like poetry. I stared at the pages, then slowly began tearing them out. One by one, no rage, just release. The wind carried some away before I could stop it, and I let it. I wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet, maybe not ever, but I was done holding onto a version of love that only existed in my mind. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft oranges and bruised purples, I whispered to myself, "This is not the end of you." It wasn't a declaration, just a small reminder that even though I'd been blocked, discarded, forgotten, I was still here, breathing, sitting, existing. And sometimes that's the bravest thing a woman can do after being broken by someone who never intended to carry her weight. I pulled my coat tighter around my body and stood. I didn't know where I was going yet, but for the first time since I landed, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was choosing myself. Shaky, quiet, but real. I spent the next few days rebuilding in small, invisible ways. I found a women's shelter that offered day programs, job leads, warm meals, even a space to rest without judgment. I told them I was just passing through, trying to figure things out, and they didn't pry. That was the first kindness I'd felt since the moment I stepped off that plane. Each day I helped in the kitchen, folded laundry, organized shelves, tasks that didn't demand smiles or explanations. One of the volunteers, an older woman named Marcia, handed me a cup of soup one afternoon and said, "You don't look broken, just tired. That's different." I don't know why, but I held on to those words. Wrote them down in a corner of my journal I hadn't torn out. At night, I returned to the hostel and laid quietly under the thin blanket, the city murmuring through the windows. I thought less about him now, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer filled the entire room. He became a dull ache instead of an open wound, and in his absence, I began to feel something else grow. Not confidence, not yet, but a kind of clarity. I had loved him with everything I didn't have. I had bled for a man who disappeared like vapor. But the mistake wasn't in loving, it was in assuming he knew how to hold it. People like him crave warmth but fear responsibility. And when they find someone willing to give too much, they drink until it's dry, then call it too much. He didn't block me because I was too intense or too desperate. He blocked me because I held up a mirror to his cowardice and he couldn't stand the reflection. One morning, while sweeping the entryway at the shelter, I overheard two women talking about a hotel looking for housekeeping help. It wasn't glamorous. Minimum wage, odd hours, no benefits, but it was something. I wrote down the number called that afternoon and was told to come in the next day. I borrowed a clean shirt from the donation bin, scrubbed my shoes until they looked passable, and practiced smiling in the mirror even though my face still carried the weight of disappointment. The interview was brief. The manager barely looked up, just scanned the form and said, "You start Monday." I thanked him and stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. For the first time since landing, I had a reason to stay beyond survival. A rhythm, a tiny thread to pull myself forward. That evening, I sat by the river, watching lights reflect on the water like little scattered truths. I pulled out my journal, what was left of it, and wrote something simple. He left. I remained. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't profound. But it was honest. I read it over and over, letting it root itself in the silence. Because staying with myself when someone else had thrown me away, that was the real act of love. I didn't know what the next few weeks would look like. I still didn't have much money or a permanent place to sleep, but I had something else now. Not hope, exactly, something grittier. A refusal to vanish. A decision to rebuild from the splinters instead of waiting for anyone to pick them up. And for the first time, I saw my own reflection not as someone who had been blocked, but as someone who had been freed. That weekend, I passed the cafe where he had once said we'd have our first real date. I hadn't planned to walk by it. The street just curved that way. It was nicer than I imagined. All glass and gold trim filled with soft laughter and people sipping things with names I couldn't pronounce. For a moment, I froze on the sidewalk. Not because I missed him, but because I missed the version of me who still believed he'd show up. The girl who thought skipping meals for love was romantic. Who thought sacrifice would be noticed if it came wrapped in sincerity. I stood there for a minute, maybe two, then did something unexpected. I walked in, I ordered a tea, the cheapest on the menu again, but this time I sat at a window seat, opened my journal, and started writing. Not about him, about me, about how it feels to disappear in someone else's dream and how long it takes to wake up. The server smiled at me like I belonged there. No one looked twice, and for the first time I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt real. I felt rooted as I sipped. I caught my reflection in the window. Still tired, still healing but whole. Not because someone chose me, but because I had stopped choosing people who didn't know how to hold what I gave. And in that tiny moment, over a paper cup and the hum of strangers' voices, I understood something I hadn't before. Being blocked wasn't the end of my story. It was just the final line of his. Mine was still being written slowly, honestly, and this time, entirely on my own terms. The first paycheck came in the form of a paper envelope, small, creased, but heavier than it looked. I held it in both hands like it was proof that I still had some control, some power. I walked 2 blocks to a secondhand store and bought myself a real meal, soup, bread, a little carton of juice, and sat on a park bench to eat slowly, savoring every bite. It wasn't about the food. It was about reclaiming something I had given away without realizing my right to care for. Myself first. I no longer stared at my phone waiting for his name to appear. I no longer rehearsed what I'd say if he ever texted again. The silence between us had once felt suffocating. Now it felt like space, breathing room, a border I didn't want crossed. At work, I kept my head down, moved quickly, earned quiet nods of approval. The other women were kind. We shared hand lotion, gum, little secrets about which guests tipped and which didn't. I told no one about the man who vanished. Not because I was ashamed, but because he didn't belong in this new chapter. That's what grief does, eventually. It doesn't disappear, but it softens at the edges, becomes background noise to louder, better things. One afternoon, as I stripped a bed in one of the hotel rooms, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled, face flushed from work. And I thought, look at you, you stayed. He left, but I didn't. I kept showing up, day after day. That resilience, I realized, had nothing to do with him. It had always lived inside me. And now, finally, it had room to breathe. I started setting small goals, save $50, find a better pair of shoes, call my sister, the one I hadn't spoken to in months because I didn't want to explain why I left without telling anyone. One evening, I dialed her number. When she picked up, her voice cracked with surprise. "Where have you been?" I paused, then said, "Trying to find myself, I guess." She didn't push. She just said, "Come home when you're ready." And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. I wasn't ready yet, but I knew now that healing didn't have to mean rushing back. It could mean choosing to rebuild in pieces with gentleness instead of urgency. I kept the job, found a shared room through a kind woman at the shelter, and moved in with nothing but a backpack and a kettle. It was enough. I decorated the wall with sticky notes, little reminders. You are not disposable. Kindness isn't weakness. He didn't block you, he freed you. On days when the ache returned, and it still did. Some mornings heavier. Then others I'd walk to the river and watch the current pull past everything in its way. I began to understand that closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you claim. Quietly, in slow, stubborn steps, in choosing not to chase the person who disappeared. In choosing not to believe that their silence means you're unworthy because it doesn't. It never did. I wasn't too much. I was just too real for someone who never planned to stay once love required more than words. On a quiet Sunday, I took the long route home after my shift and passed a sidewalk musician playing a song I used to love, one he once sent me with. A message that read, "This made me think of you." I paused, listening from across the street, unsure of what the melody would stir in me now, but strangely it didn't hurt. It didn't rip anything open. Instead, it floated past like an old photograph, familiar but no longer alive. That was the moment I realized I had crossed an invisible threshold. The version of me who skipped meals, who counted coins, who believed love was about sacrifice and silence, she wasn't gone. She had just evolved. I still carried her, but now she had boundaries. Now she had breath. Back at my tiny room, I brewed a cup of tea and sat on the floor, writing a letter I'd never send. "You didn't break me," I wrote. "You simply reminded me of the cracks I was already patching with other people's promises." I folded the paper and tucked it behind my journal, right next to the line I had written weeks ago. He left, I remained. Only now, I added a new one underneath, and I became. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the soft ticking of the old clock by the window, I didn't wish for him to call. I didn't wonder if he missed me. I didn't need a full circle moment or a tearful apology, because the apology I needed the most had finally come from myself, for all the ways I had made myself smaller, for the meals I skipped, for the silence I accepted, and for ever believing that love meant being invisible. Weeks later, a message appeared in my inbox, an unfamiliar account. No profile photo, just a name I once memorized without trying. It was him. "Hey, I know I disappeared. I just wasn't ready." I panicked. I stared at the screen, heart steady in a way that surprised me. Months ago, I would have dropped the phone, shaken with a mix of anger and hope. But now, the words felt small. Late, I didn't open the message right away. I made tea first, folded laundry, sat on my balcony, and watched the sky shift through pinks and golds. When I finally clicked it open, the message went on paragraphs about confusion, how he wasn't sure what he wanted, how he hoped I was okay. He didn't ask what I went through. He didn't mention the airport, or the days I wandered that city with nowhere to sleep, just vague guilt, packaged neatly. I could have responded. I could have told him everything, sent a photo of the soup kitchen, of the cot in the shelter, of my swollen feet after walking all day to save bus fare. But I didn't, because he wasn't writing for me. He was writing for himself, to clear his conscience, not to carry mine. I closed the message and deleted it without replying. No rage, no sadness, just quiet, firm clarity. That was my closure. Not because I said anything, but because I chose silence, not out of pain, but out of power. He had blocked me once too. Avoid discomfort now. I was choosing peace to protect my own, and in that tiny act, I reclaimed something sacred, my voice, even when it says nothing at all. A few days later, I stood at the front desk of the hotel, now with a fresh uniform and a quiet confidence that came not from praise but from persistence. One of the guests, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, left me a folded note on the nightstand that simply read, "Thank you for your care. You made this place feel safe." I held it for a long time, not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me that my presence, even in small, unnoticed moments, could still hold meaning. That night, I taped the note beside my mirror, next to my sticky reminders. I read them all aloud. You are not disposable. He didn't block you. He freed you. You remained. You became. Each sentence stitched something back together inside me. I no longer fantasized about being seen by him. I no longer needed the version of love that begged for attention or permission. I was creating a different kind of love now, one that didn't leave me hungry, quiet, or waiting in airports. I saw it in the way I cared for myself after long shifts, in the way I wrote poetry in the margins of old receipts, in how I now called my sister every Sunday and told her honestly when I was struggling. That was my new rhythm. Not survival, but soft rebuilding. Steady, imperfect, and mine. There are still days when the memory tugs, not of him, but of the girl who believed he would catch her. I grieve her gently, but I don't wish her back. Because in losing him, I met someone far more worthy. The version of me that finally chose herself. This morning. I made breakfast without counting the cost of each item. Just eggs, toast, and a little fruit. Nothing fancy, but it felt like abundance. I sat by the window as the light warmed the floor and realized I hadn't thought of him at all until now. Not because the pain was gone entirely, but because it no longer sat at the front of everything. It had taken its place behind the strength I'd earned, behind the woman I had become. I opened my journal and wrote a final note beneath all the others. He blocked me after the flight landed. But I'm the one who walked away. Not in shame, not in silence, but with a soft, defiant grace. Because that's what healing looks like. Sometimes not a grand moment, not a speech or a scream, but the quiet act of living well when someone thought you wouldn't. Later, I'll go to work. I'll sweep the floors, change the sheets, smile at guests like I always do. But inside, something is different now. I'm not holding space for anyone who cannot hold me back. I'm not skipping meals to be loved. I'm not waiting by phones or gates or windows. I'm building my own door, and if someone wants to knock one day, they'll have to meet me where I already stand. Whole-fed scene. So to anyone who's ever sacrificed more than they should have for someone who gave less than they promised, you are not foolish. You are not weak. You are someone who loves deeply. And now, maybe, it's time to love yourself with that same fire. So let me ask you gently, if you stopped waiting, what could you finally begin?